Welcome, Synthesizer sickos. I'm Vulture Culture. Tonight we are going to be asking the question, is the Korg Wavestation from 1991 a legendary synthesizer? We have been putting the most iconic synthesizers to the test to see if they earn that legendary status. Tonight's live stream is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to go through a bunch of the famous presets on the Korg Wavestation. This is actually a Wavestation EX, which came out the year after. While we do that, I'm going to be, playing some sounds and going through some of the history of this synthesizer. It is a very cool, very famous piece of 90s digital synthesis, and I'm very excited to have you guys here. And then after we've covered that, we'll cover how much you can expect to pay for one of these bad boys on the used market right now versus what they came out for, and the devaluation adjusted for inflation and all of that. Famous users of this Wavestation, especially talking about David Wise and the Donkey Kong Country series for the SNES. We'll get into that. And then the crowning achievement of this podcast, which is the Legendary Synthesizer test, which is a criteria of 11 questions devised by yourself and myself to figure out if a synthesizer can be called legendary. And the great thing about it is that, well, as I do. So we're going to be voting in the chat. We're going to be posting polls in the chat. That's how we do it here. So welcome to the channel. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. And this is the Wave song. If you play all at once, it stays in key, but if I sort of add some roll to it, it can get very chaotic quickly. And that has a lot to do with how the Wavestation actually works. It's not like a typical synthesizer in the way that it's got oscillators into a filter, subtractive style synthesis, but instead it cycles through waves in what's called a wave sequence. And so we're going to hear some more of that. Yes, Tony Banks used the Wavestation. In particular, Tony Banks used it on the Genesis album, We Can't Dance album, and you can hear a lot of it on that particular album, which is super cool. This one, Deep Atmosphere, one of my favorites. This patch, Deep Atmosphere, I don't know how well you can see this on the camera here. It's very clear to me, but sometimes with the lighting and stuff, it can blow out the image there. If you like that patch, actually, I would just like to sell out for a second and say that I've sampled 6 of the patches: Deep Atmosphere, Entropy, Will I Dream, Alpine Bells, Antarctica, and the Big Pad for the Legendary Synthesizer Sample Pack. Right now it's $30. However, if you use the exclusive code to viewers of this very live stream, SKIJAM, so that's SKIJAM in all caps, you can get $10 off. So it's only $20, and it's got 100 patches, over 2,000 stereo wave files, as well as SFZ files, so you can load them into Serum 2 or other samplers. Some of my favorite patches from legendary synthesizers that we've shown on this very stream. Sting Waves. Yeah, and there you can really hear the Prophet VS sort of history to the synthesizer. It's got that sort of sound. Not every sound in the Wavestation, by the way, is like super waves sequency. We've got some... cool. By the way, Sebastian, how's it going, my friend? Yeah, Jean-Michel Jarre, Revolutions album, actually opens with a wave sequence from the D50. It sounds like it's a Wavestation from the Wavestation, but it's actually a patch in the D50 that I recreated for Neon Chronicles, my patch library for the D50. But an incredible synthesizer nonetheless. Also a very famous patch, Mini Lead. Really awesome use of those wave sequencing to get sorts of sounds that sound like what you're hearing is, more of like a wave sequency type thing. But the truth is it's actually, or it sounds like you're hearing resonances, but the truth is it's wave sequencing, which is super kind of a different way to go about things that you wouldn't always expect. We got some horns. Guardians. Oh, I love this one. Devastation Zero, what's up, brother? Can I get a scum cheers in the chat? How's it going, Carl? The AD is the rack mount version, or one of the two rack mount versions, and it has a vocoder in it, which is super awesome. The only version that you can do vocoding with. Digital Res Wave. Sandman. Okay, so this is a very interesting patch because if you are an owner of a Mac, you might remember something that sounds kind of like this. And the reason is because it's a modified version of this patch. I have it written down here. It was a Wavestation EX by Apple sound designer Jim Reeks, modified this particular patch, Sandman, to do the Apple startup chime, which I think is very charming. You can hear that sound is in there, but then also a lot more. And just so many of these sounds are these beautiful ultraviolet glassy pad sounds, and so it sort of excels at three types of sounds. I would say it's like the glassy pad thing, the ultraviolet digital thing, and then it does these rapid arpeggio type sounds, which you were just hearing, and then you hear the more staccato bassline-y type things too. My boy Nathan, how's it going, Nathan? The PS1 startup sound is actually the Roland D50, another synthesizer that I love and have featured heavily on this channel. Those types of sounds. Cosmic Zone. Particularly nice when I play the right notes. So these really smooth interpolations between different waveforms. Toy box. And you could hear these incredible Korg effects. So all the way back in 1990, which is already 35 years ago, the effects from Korg were just giving everybody else a run for their money. Analog brass. So you know, that's in there. The way that these sounds evolve was like nothing else, and they sold so many of these synthesizers. And Korg had just 2 years earlier set the record for most synths sold with the M1. So this was really a time for Korg to just kick a lot of ass. So while I'm playing some patches, I'm also going to go through some of the history. So if you really want to understand what wave sequencing is, you have to go all the way back to 1958. Where Max Matthews actually invented wavetable synthesis for Music 2, which was one of the first, if not the first, computer programs to do any sort of synthesis. And he did that at Bell Labs in, of all places, New fucking Jersey. Yes, it is history time. Whisper Voices, such a great patch. I think used by Enigma on a lot of their early stuff. The Bell Labs building used for the show Severance. That's awesome. Super, super cool. So anyways, in 1981, Wolfgang Palm invented the PPG Wave, right? And this is the iconic wavetable synth. And it's a hybrid synthesizer. So the idea was using digital memory to store a lookup table of waves, also known as a wave table. And so as these different snapshots of sound, so very, very, very short snippets, and the PPG Wave could actually step through those waves. Now, in modern sort of the world of like Native Instruments, Massive, and Serum, we think of wavetables as like smoothly blending between sounds, but PPG Wave was really just like almost more like a deck of playing cards, where you're just stepping from like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there wasn't any blending. It's just if you did it fast enough, you didn't really notice, which is, you know, where the technology was in 1981. I did dub. I have to say there's not that many great patches on the H card for the Wavestation. There's a few, but mostly there's actually a few really cool kind of industrial, more bread and butter sounds, but not so many great Wavestationing patches. As far as I can tell, the best patches just are the presets. Spirit Grove, yeah. So wave sequencing is this idea of when, we'll see if we can find a good patch that does it. This one will do it. It's blending between different waves. So if you're familiar with like saw, square, sine, triangle from traditional analog synthesis, that's 4 waves, right? And you could do a wave sequence of blending between those 4. In fact, you can kind of do it on the Korg monopoly that I have back here. You can step through the different, the 4 oscillators there. And to me, that's sort of like the precursor to something like the Wavestation, because it could move through those waves. But what you can do here is now use all sorts of crazy waves, stuff from the Prophet VS and a lot of other sound sources, even samples, even short samples, to get these crazy evolving. Yeah, Portal Complex, definitely post the track and everybody open it up in a separate window and come back and check it out after the live stream, because I'd love to check it out. And then it just excels at these types of sounds, these beautiful, breathy. And so let's talk about the VS then. So it would have been 1986, Sequential Circuits, the famous company that invented the Prophet 5 and revolutionized the polysynth world. We really wouldn't have synths like this if it wasn't for the Prophet 5. And 1986, the company's on the verge of going bankrupt, and they put out sort of a Hail Mary product, the Prophet VS. And what they innovated there was they could take 4 digital oscillators. Now, there wasn't the wave sequencing component, but what they did give you was this vector synthesis. So adding this key joystick here, not keyboard, but joystick, you can hear that I can blend between the different layers. Not the best patch for that. Let's try a different one. Try something. A couple of these more simple ones. Warm strings was used a lot by many. Need a good wave sequency one. So this is a good example where you could blend between the different layers going on. So the Prophet VS invented what was called vector synthesis over a case of beer one night. And so that case of beer was actually shared by Chris Meyer and Josh Jeffe. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. And they came up with this idea of like, what if you could blend? And on that synth in particular, you could program in sort of automatic movements of the vector with things like envelopes. And they had like interesting loopable envelopes for that type of thing. Definitely has that sort of enigma sort of sound. And so the D50 copied the VS the following year, 1987, the Roland D50. And then the Kawai K1 copied the D50 in 88 using this sort of joystick thing. And Sequential Circuits went bankrupt in 1987, and it was taken over by Yamaha for research and development. So all the guys at the Sequential Circuits office basically became Yamaha employees. They pitched him the idea of the Wavestation and a couple of other things like a sampler, and Yamaha couldn't figure it the fuck out. They have the inventor of the Prophet 5 on their team, and he's like, hey, I've got this great idea, and if you take this idea, you could just print money. And they were like, yeah, I don't know. So then they decide to kick him out. But Korg at the time was interested in acquiring him for R&D, and Yamaha had a controlling stake in stocks for Korg at the time. So Korg was allowed to sort of absorb Dave Smith and John Bowen, and who else was there? It was also Scott Peterson and Stanley Jungleib, I think I'm saying his name correctly, but not Chris and Josh, who worked on the Prophet VS. But anyways, they were absorbed into Korg, and they went ahead on the Wavestation project. And what's interesting about it is that they had to change some of their plans because Korg at the time did not have a resonant filter. So the D50 did from Roland, and the Yamaha SY77 did, but Korg didn't with the M1, and so the Wavestation doesn't have a resonant filter. It's interesting hypothesis you bring up the SY22. They went Mormon with the John Smith EX101. So I actually have here The Prophet from Silicon Valley. This is a great book by David Abernathy, and it's the story of sequential circuits. And I wanted to actually read a part of it because I believe I've spread some misinformation on this channel before about the SY22 because Yamaha, of course, had Dave Smith on his team, and then they put out a vector synth the same year as the Wavestation. So I'll just read his quote here from the book. The first NAMM show when we showed the Wavestation, this is Dave Smith speaking, I remember an old friend came up and said, how's it feel having 2 new products at the show? And I said, 2? We only have 1, just the Wavestation. He said, Yamaha has this SY22. You must have had something to do with that. And I said, what is it? And he said, it's a combination vector synthesis machine. It has FM and samples. And I thought, ooh, that does sound familiar. But basically what Yamaha did, they took notes from my meeting and they went ahead and designed it by themselves and never even asked me about it, even though it was my idea. And then also around the same time, there was an audio magazine that printed new patents. And I remember reading this one new patent from Yamaha and I realized that when I first explained how wave sequencing worked, they went out and patented it, even though they were telling me it wouldn't work. This was after the Wavestation was already out. So it's kind of interesting how they worked, which is super polite but shady of Dave Smith. Kind of interesting how they worked. Funny thing is, it was all their property. He's referencing here that they owned Korg as well. They owned anything I did at the time, so there was no reason to keep it secret. And I just wanted to read that because in the past I've said Dave Smith helped design the Yamaha SY22 as well, and that's not really true. What's true is that they went and told him his idea sucked. It wouldn't work. They passed on it, but secretly they patented it. And the only reason Korg wasn't in violation of that pattern was that Yamaha also owned Korg. So it's a little bit of like behind the scenes tea there, which is super interesting. And I've always wanted to tell that story since I read the book. A little bit of a D50 sound. We have this Prophet horn. This really does have hearken. I wouldn't say it sounds like a Prophet 5, but... So I believe that's using the non-resonant filter, right? There's no filter resonance in there. So yeah, this one's mahogany. And we're listening to performances. There's patches and wave sequences. There's a whole architecture to this. And all of these sounds to me have this sort of like weird hyper thing to them where they're not really realistic. So if you wanted like a realistic guitar sound, for instance, there's a pretty good acoustic guitar sample in the M1. This synthesizer came out 2 years after, so the M1 was 88, this was 90. And it has the original only had 2 megabytes of ROM in it, which was like thought of as not being as good. But the goal was to come up with these really different types of sounds. Like that to me doesn't sound like a real jazz guitar, but it sounds incredible. And it's because it's using this sort of Wavestation thing. Sonic Bytes, yeah, I agree. It's really the default presets that we're listening to now. That's where the hotness is. I guess that's approaching that, sort of realistic sound. Craziest Fantasia. Yes, Spirit Groove. John Skippy Lemcool did work on the Wavestation. I believe he worked on the drums mostly, but he did work on it, and it's definitely sort of his breakout role, I would say. It's a beautiful patch. Reality asks, do I want the Polybrute 12? Yes, I do. Do I want to pay for it? No, I don't. That's it, Travis. What you just said. 90s kids can feel the Wavestation in my heart from its heavy use in movies and TV. Obviously, it was used in X-Files. It was used everywhere. It was such a groundbreaking synthesizer, and everybody was using it. Just a gorgeous, another example of a gorgeous patch. Asks, have I played with the Wavestation VST? And yes, I have. I think the Wavestation VST is awesome. And a little known feature of the Wavestation VST is if you route the MIDI out of your Wavestation, plug it into your computer, it actually works as a hardware controller. So as you scroll through patches, it will scroll through the patches on the VST and vice versa. It's actually, or not vice versa, but it's actually really cool that they went out of their way that if you control the VST with the actual hardware, like the things work, the joystick works and the patch select works. I don't think that's crazy, Parbs. I'm much more likely to get an Andromeda over a Polybrute 12 as well. It does use an old school memory card. I'm using an H-Card 101. I've done several videos on it. They were kind enough to send it over to me. H-Card 101 from Hypersynth is a multi-synthesizer, multi-bank library of sounds, as well as blank banks that you can make your own sounds. It works with the M1, the T series, the A series from Korg, the DS8, their FM synthesizer, and the Wavestation, and I'm probably forgetting something else. It's incredible to buy one memory card that works for all of them. So when I had an M1, I would just pop it in and use it over there, and then I just pop it into the Wavestation. It just works perfectly. So. Synth sounds just so freaking good. Resonant synth. Now, I believe, I don't know the actual answer on this. I was trying to figure it out. If the EX added the resonant filter or not. The Georgie, the VST goes on the sale every year in the holidays. So if you could get it like close to December during the holiday sale, it's 50% off, which is when I recommend going for it. Yeah. So definitely a thing. We didn't get resonance until the VST. Okay, thank you very much, Todd. I didn't think so, but I've heard the claim before. And we do have a patch. So what you're hearing here, it sounds like a filter with, a shitty digital filter, but a resonant filter nonetheless. But it's not. It's actually just the samples, the wave sequence in there, giving us that sort of vibe, which is an interesting thing. Videos on the H-Card 101, definitely worth checking out if you own one or more of those vintage Korg synthesizers. So I want to talk a little bit about what the market was like at the time that the Korg Wavestation came out, 1990. So end of the 80s, 88, 89 is what I call the beginning of the ultraviolet era, because I used to say vintage digital to talk about these synths, but the thing is a synth like this has nothing to do really with the FM technology that dominated digital synthesis in the 80s from 1983 with the launch of the Yamaha DX7. So with the D50 in 87, you get the first ultraviolet synthesizer, which is sort of more sample plus synthesis. And then the Wavestation is the next major breakthrough because the M1 is basically D50-like, but from Korg, and the SY77 is basically D50-like, but from Yamaha. But the Wavestation is a brand new type of ultraviolet synthesis, and it just sounds incredible. So analog synths had died out. Many of the people who watch this channel will be kind of familiar with this, but for the new people, it's worth reiterating that even though today we are all lusting after synthesizers like the Polybrute 12, back then analog was thought of as being old and dated and boring, and the future was with all of these brand new digital synthesizers that could do sounds that were way more flexible and realistic sounding than an analog synth could do. And so ARP, Moog, and Sequential had all gone out of business at this point, and Roland, Korg, and Yamaha were no longer making analog synths. And so the other big thing about this that I want to mention about this era is workstations, okay? And so workstations for a real synthesizer snob, can I get some scum snobs in the chat? That's the true, like, anathema, like just the thing you hate the most is a workstation, because it's a black box that, you know, you can sort of put a whole song together, but like it doesn't excel at anything. And the M1, arguably the Ensoniq SQ80, but certainly the M1, going on to be the highest selling synthesizer of all time, it really solidified that that's what people wanted. They wanted one synth with a lot of multi-timbrality so that they could compose an entire song with the sequencer in it. So you've got that, the SY77, the VFX, the Roland W30 was a sampler plus sequencer. So that was really popular at the time. And Dave Smith and his team said, you know what? Fuck that. I don't want any part of that. I want to make a pure synth. I want to make something that's about synthesis. So there's no onboard sequencer. There's no fucking arpeggiator, although you can get arpeggiated type sounds that you've already heard by using wave sequencing, right? But essentially, it was a move back towards what was good about synthesis. And Roland would follow us up with the JD800 the following year, 1991. They would go ahead and make an ultraviolet synth that was covered in faders so that you could program your own sounds on it, which sadly the Wavestations don't have. It would take them another like 20 fucking years, 25 years to come out with Wavestate. Hear how it, like, the way that they were able to come up with this idea to fit all of these sounds into 2 megabytes. 2 fucking megabytes. I mean, think about that. To put that into perspective, I think the Legendary Synths Sample Pack is like 4 gigs or pretty close to that. So it was all this clever use of morphing between waves that gives the sound this organic life to it. Welcome to the stream. How's it going, my friend? By the way, can I get a scum cheers in the chat for everybody who makes this community fucking amazing? I appreciate you guys so much. If you're new here, like and subscribe so you too can become a member of this awesome community. I appreciate all of you guys. Can I get some scum cheers in the chat? Cheers, guys. Taryn, ultraviolet is my phrase I've coined to describe this middle phase of digital synthesis. So the way I would say it is there's sort of prehistoric digital synthesis. You know, DK Synergy, Synclavier is kind of in here. I guess the Synclavier is really a sampler. And it's not until we get the DX7, couple of earlier, like I think it's the GS1, but basically the DX7 starts the FM synthesis revolution. So I used to use the phrase vintage digital to refer to all of these synthesizers, but really 80s vintage digital synths mostly we're talking about the DX7. Then with the start of the D50, we get a very different kind of sound, which is this sample plus synthesis thing. So all digital, but you know, synthesis plus sampling. And I call this the ultraviolet era because so many of the music videos and stuff are like foggy warehouses that are lit ultraviolet. And there's just a certain sound to like the D50, the JD800, the Wavestation, the Ensoniq VFX, and the TS10, the SD1. I know I'm missing a couple of other ones that come to mind. But there's just these synths that have this certain character to them that, and it's, then I kind of cut it off when we get to the Nord lead in the Access virus. So when we enter the virtual analog era of vintage digital synthesis, that's its own thing too. We have only covered one of the banks so far. So let's go ahead and jump into some of these other sounds here. Oh, I think I need to reload some of these. So we can jump into the card here and check out some of these. So like Wave Police. So they ended up adding in some actual piano sounds. So with the Wavestation EX that came out the year after in 91, they doubled the sample size to 4 megabytes and they added drums and pianos because people were upset that it didn't have those like types of sounds in it because they were expecting basically everything from Korg to be able to do the M1 plus more. And that's not what this synthesizer is. Wish I still had the M1 here just to check out if it's the exact same piano. Cello ensemble's really great. How's it going, Adapt Manipulate? So I believe this is the saxophone patch that was used by David Wise in Aquatic Ambiance. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So the thing about the Wavestation is it's got 32 voices of polyphony with 4 oscillators all running at the same time, which is pretty insane, and they're all different wave sequences. So the way you can think of it is a wave sequence is essentially the patch, and the performance is a collection of all of that. Technically, there's a difference because you also have like how your effects are routed and things. But what's crazy about wave sequencing on the Wavestation is how over the top it was. A wave sequence can have 255 different waves stored in it, all with different pitches and durations. So unlike what you might be thinking is this is sort of like a little sequencers built in, but not really, because each wave has its own time. And what that allows you to think of it as is this synthesizer is not tempo-based. Even though you have a lot of tempo-based sounds, they're not really like being generated by a MIDI clock, although you can do that. You can route a MIDI clock into it and then trigger the wave sequences by the MIDI clock. But if you don't do that, it's basically just how they were programmed inside of the synth. So now we have some of the sounds like more M1 type sounds. Reality, I'm not sure if you're asking the question of like what MIDI controller is this? This is a real Wavestation EX from 1991. The Wave, I do have a couple of MIDI controllers like an Alesis VI61, but I don't think that's what you're asking me. Some bass sounds. You know, very equivalent stuff that you could find in the Yamaha synths at the time as well. Yeah, I mean, that is what it is. Lots of these sorts of... Got some pretty cool drum sounds, actually. Probably could do something pretty similar to it. Let's see. Nylon guitar. Pretty good bass sound here. Yes, so Dave Smith, it's not just derivative. He actually designed this synth. Along with a few other people. I had it written down over here. John Bowen, creator of the Prophet 5, Scott Peterson and Stanley Jungleb, but a bunch of other people too. I don't want to make it seem like there's only that. So yeah, the original Wavestation, 2 megabytes of ROM, and then the EX following year, 4 megabytes, and it had acoustic piano sounds and all of the remaining Prophet VS waveforms. So the Prophet VS waveforms are in here. Then that same year, they came out with the AD rack. And what's super cool about the rack mount version, it's a 2U rack mount, and it can be used as a vocoder. So it's the only version of the Wavestation that's a vocoder as well. And then the following year, 1992, they came out with a 1 rack version. And this is sort of like the Proteus of the line, where it's just a single rack. And you technically can program it, but has a very small display. But the cool thing is they integrated additional cards that they sold separately previously into it. So it's got more patches than the other Wavestations, which is great. Reality says, I misspoke. What MIDI interface do you have is what I mean. I'm using a Motu MIDI Express 128. That's how I am running MIDI in here. So I want to keep going here. Very beautiful bell sound. The velocity is programmed so great on all of these too. You do have aftertouch on this as well. This is one of the patches I used in the intro. Really great. Love a Scumbird. Poly Aftertouch? No. There were no synths coming out this time that had Poly Aftertouch. I mean, what was it? Maybe the Chroma Expander, or it's just the Rhodes Chroma and the Expander and the Sequential Prophet T8 would have had polyphonic aftertouch, but I think after that, people basically gave up on poly aftertouch for a long time. And of course, the Ensonics were still coming out. That patch was A Touch of Rain. So beautiful, right? Analog strings. So I want to talk about what is, to me, my most personally inspiring part of the history of the Wavestation. So in the early 90s, Rare was making games for Nintendo. They did some stuff for the Nintendo Entertainment System, the original home console. And with the Super Nintendo coming out, they started working on Donkey Kong. And they were using the state-of-the-art computers that they used on the Terminator movies and things like that to create CGI to make the incredible graphics for the time. Of course, this would have been 1994, 95, something like that. And David Wise, the composer of Donkey Kong, wanted to match the incredible sound, and he had a Wavestation and thought it just sounded great. And it inspired him to realize that a Super Nintendo it works kind of similar to a Wavestation in that you could sequence waves in there however you wanted. And so he did an experiment to see if he could do wave sequencing on a Super Nintendo, which, by the way, only has 64 kilobytes of RAM for all of the audio that fits on a video game. So if you think they had to compress the samples to get him onto this, just imagine what he had to do. One great thing about the Hypersynth is I can actually just pull up, I can change the where I'm at, and now it just automatically updates here. And we can get all sorts of different sounds. Really beautiful. Let's see if, which one am I looking for? RAM 1? somewhere around here is where I'm looking for Will I Dream. Let's see if it works. So I'm actually going to pull up here real quick and have it on my, let's go to MIDI aux. And I'm going to send a 6x file to this. So sometimes things get a little wonky in here. And so what I'm going to do is just make sure to send the actual factory content into the synthesizer real quick. Doesn't take that long. You can see it's receiving MIDI sysx. Just to make sure, because you have patches, performances, and wave sequences. And if you edit a wave sequence on one patch, you're going to change it on another one, if that makes sense. So I'm spitting over that now, and we'll see if that changes how this patch sounds. Hopefully it will. Let's see. It's just finishing up real quick. But so anyways, David Wise actually went... He left the building that Rareware was working at and stayed in a cattle shed next door to it because he needed like silence away from the chaos of the main programming team for 5 weeks, and programmed the bass line of Aquatic Ambiance and the song as an experiment to see if it would work. Let's see if this patch sounds any different now. See, that's how this patch is supposed to sound. And when I went and played it, I was like, oh yeah, this isn't it. So this patch, Will I Dream, is one of my favorite patches. And yes, I did sample it for the Legendary Synthesizer Sample Pack. How much changing the sound overwrites the patch? I don't know what that means. If you don't save, you're not going to overwrite the patch. I have saved different data in here, which was changing things. Such a classic patch. Fire dance here. How it sounds down low. Here's how it sounds. Real gritty sort of ultraviolet sound. If you change a wave sequence, it doesn't overwrite the patch, it overwrites the wave sequence, which is used by other patches. Does that make sense? Am I making that clear, hopefully? So like a lot of Korg and Yamaha, I'm not that into when they try to do analog type sounds. Yeah, and Carl, if you watch the pilot episode, you will hear the Will I Dream patch in it immediately because Mark Frost did use it in that. And so David Wise, by the way, I actually have the original Japanese release for the Famicom version of the DKC games here. I always like kind of just having them around makes me feel, a sort of connection to that. And he also used the Roland Alpha Juno 2 and a rack mount Roland U220, which is the sampler. I had the keyboard version for a while, and we've collectively decided that's a dubious synth to buy. It really doesn't sound that great, but he used it for basic string and sort of orchestral type sounds, more so on the Donkey Kong Country 2 soundtrack. And then an R8 was his drum machine, which is a very famous industrial drum machine. So many great sounds in here. Snow. I always get that confused because Mark Frost is the author of Twin Peaks. Just incredible. Paul, welcome to the stream. How's it going? And I don't know if many people realize this, but the name of this channel is actually a reference to David Wise's soundtrack. So the first level of the third world of Donkey Kong Country is Vulture Culture. And so I named my band that years ago, and this channel is an extension of that. And so it's really exciting to have the Wavestation, which is essentially the genesis of the soundtracks of these games, because when I was growing up, I didn't grow up listening to analog synth music really all that much. I listened to the music of these video games and things. And the thing is, for those of you guys who aren't as familiar with David Wise's music, there was no such thing as ambient music in video games before aquatic ambience and the sounds of Donkey Kong Country. There was like bleep bloopy type stuff, you know, like it sounded very Game Boy-esque, which could still sound good, you know, but it wasn't beautiful. And then out of the fucking blue, the soundtracks were incredible, even compared to everything else on the SNES, because most of the other composers could barely fit like a few half-decent crunchy samples onto their soundtracks. I mean, if you listen to Super Mario World by the great Koji Kondo, of course, it's got a lot of iconic themes, but the sound doesn't sound anywhere near as awesome as Donkey Kong Country. So I'm just a huge fan of David Wise. The fact that he's watched some of the videos on this channel is just crazy to me. And I'm so happy we just showed up at Midnight Run. So there's, in all of the Hornet levels from Donkey Kong Country 2, they sample this patch. So that's the lore on Vulture Culture. So what else is there to talk about? I want to talk about the street price of one of these guys and the price of what these were when they came out. So when this came out, it came out for $21.95, which is pretty reasonable when you consider that the DX7 was about $2,000 when it launched in '83, and something like the Yamaha SY77 was about $3,000 at the time. So it's a pretty fair price. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be a price of, I believe, what is it, $5,559, I think is what I had, or six. Sorry, I actually deleted my note here. I guess I could run it through real quick just to make sure I get this right. So here we go. Bear with me. This has been an interesting stream. We've had a couple of little hiccups to it. If in 1990 I paid 21, then it would be 53. There we go. 53.59. So that's the number, 53.59 in adjusted money. And the really cool thing about this synthesizer is the street price on these is not bad. And the reason is they sold so many. So Roland the next year would come out with the JD800, which has a very similar sound palette to the Wavestation, but it just got crushed because the Wavestation was both cheaper and just so varied. And so people didn't really buy JD800s as much, and therefore the price is a lot higher because of supply and demand. So what's really cool is you can get one of these bad boys, and I averaged the street price out by getting the 3 cheapest synths on Reverb, where everything works, every key, knob, and function works. I don't mind a few battle scars. This one's got a couple of battle scars. I actually like a little bit of patina on my synthesizers. And it includes the shipping. So including shipping, you can expect to pay about $650 for one of these guys, which I think is still very fair for how beautiful these synths sound. I wanted to point out, though, that right now there is a Wavestation EX in Virginia for $525 with shipping. So that's a super cool deal. I think the battery needs to be replaced. That's not the hardest thing in the world to do. If anybody feels a little handy, they could jump on that deal now, and that would be super cool. So that's what these are worth right now, and that's a devaluation of 88%, which is about what we've come to expect from a lot of the synthesizers in this area. Let's see here. Harmonic motion. I mean, it just sounds so good, doesn't it? Taryn asks, is there a world where you would choose this over the M1? Not only is there a world, we're living in it right now, because I very happily gave the M1 I had back to my friend Brando in order to keep this synthesizer. Now, one thing I will say is Korg's legacy collection of VSTs is an incredible way to get the sounds of the Wavestation and the Korg M1. At a very reasonable price. Each of the plugins is about $100, and they go on sale in the holidays for 50% off. That's when I bought them myself as part of the legacy collection. And they do a really great job of emulating the sound of the hardware. The biggest difference in the legacy collection is the samples still have that crunchy thing going on, but they're no longer constrained by the internal 33 kilohertz sampling rate, which is part of what gives it this crunchy, digital, glassy, specific type of sound. Je ne sais quoi, as I like to say. And the thing is, for most people, most of the time, it probably doesn't matter. I mean, if we were to compare one patch to the other, the sound of wave sequencing is so iconic that if I played Ski Jam back to back with this versus that, you'd probably go, you know what, 6 1/2 dozen to the other. But for us snobs, again, can I get some scum snobs in the chat? The sound of the hardware is different. This chorus and bell so... One of the best ultraviolet choir sounds up there with the K1 and K4. It's so beautiful, the sound. Yeah, so it's just got that lo-fi thing. For the spam, I appreciate it. That's a good question, Java Ally. I would like that answer. I mean, I think the answer is that their plugins eat so much of your CPU. I just don't know if it would work necessarily. They're just not as good at optimizing. Yeah, and that's the thing, Carl. All of the Wavestations are just brutal to program, and sequencing is difficult too because, again, the wave sequences contain the time data, and it's not constrained to tempo necessarily. In fact, in the intro jam, I had to set my DAW to 104.25 BPM because that seemed to be pretty close to the tempo. So I could show you how to do it real quick. I don't know how well you can see it on stream though. Let me see if I can. I don't think so. You go to global, and then you just go to wave sequence sync, and you can change that from internal to MIDI. And that's the trick, to where if you have MIDI clock going into the synthesizer, then it'll step through the waves based on the MIDI clock and not based on that. So that's the best way. But one thing I've noticed is sometimes the way that those samples and wave sequences are set up, even if you're feeding it MIDI clock information, it's kind of like going to give you a polyrhythm or something. It's not going to give you like always a perfect like 16 beat bar type thing for most examples. And also the sound of that sort of flute type of sound was used in Donkey Kong by Elena Novakovic. And the ironic thing is that the actual level, Vulture Culture, was scored by Elena Novakovic and not by David Wise. So that's a little bit of a funny thing. I didn't know that at the time that I named my band that back when I was like 21 or something like that. So just a little tidbit there. Oh my God. Damn. What a beautiful sound. Vox Concrete, that's correct. So good. So the thing is, if you want to get the sound, but you don't want to spend $600 on the hardware, there are some alternatives. And let me go look and see. there was a Wavestation SR I saw for $305 with shipping. So if you just want the sounds, you can get there for $305 if you're a snob like me and you want that vintage digital crunch. If you don't really care, you can get the plugin, which is awesome, for $99 or $50 on sale. And what's also great about the plugin is it has all of the ROM cards and all of the additional sample data. So just like the M1, you can load patches in, but you also can load different waves to use in wave sequencing. And so you get all of that in the Wavestation VST. So for that reason alone, it's really useful. And to be honest with you guys, I hate to admit this live on the internet in front of people, but sometimes when I'm working on music, I just use the VST because it's got everything and you can just search for the type of patch you're looking for. And it's got more patches than this, even with an H-Card 101. It just is what it is. The other thing I have to mention, of course, would be Korg's Wavestate Mark II. So 25 years later or whatever, they came out with Wavestate, and it was their update. They called it Wave Sequencing 2.0. And it's essentially their attempt to make wave sequencing more intuitive. And what's super great, too, is they actually had David Wise on their channel teaching people how to program his type of sounds on the Wavestate. So if you haven't yet, go search Wavestate David Wise and check out his tutorials. They are incredible. As well as a bunch of other ones like Luke from Korg always does the best. I love that, his voice and everything. But Wavestate is a phenomenal both plugin and piece of hardware. We've checked out the plugin on this channel before. You can go back and check that out. But what I will say about Wavestate is it does not sound like the Wavestation. It sounds good, and you have all of the original content from the Wavestation in it, but it just doesn't come together like the Wavestation. But it's a much more friendly synth to program. So if you want to make a new sound, obviously the Wavestate's the way to go. There's probably no better example of, like, when you're comparing a vintage synth to the modern version, that you're going to hear me say, go modern. Because I love vintage synths, and a lot of times you can get a lot of really great ones for not that much. But Wavestate's just great as far as if you want to make music and you want to make your own sounds, because programming a Wavestation is a nightmare. It's been akin to trying to paint a hallway through a through a keyhole, like it's just brutal. But that's also my opinion. I think some people might disagree with me and be like, well, I don't know. It's definitely got something in here. And there is that, they're running a sale right now on Wavestate SE, the special edition 61 key version that does have aftertouch. And I think they're only like $1,300 right now. So that would probably be, to be honest with you, it's at this point in my life, probably I should just get a Wavestate SE and sell this and use the Wavestate SE to control the Korg VST, like the VST version of the Wavestation when I want those sounds. That probably would make the most sense, but I just have a love for this vintage type of sound. That's a good question, Adapt. I think this thing is so sort of tied to ambient. And to me, it's just gorgeous in that way. But I don't know that if you want to make industrial music, this probably can't be your only synth. I think this really shines at a certain thing. So a couple more things to talk about. Genesis used it on the We Can't Dance album. Michael Jackson on the song History, programmed by Steve Porcaro from Toto. Dire Straits' Planet of New Orleans. You can clearly hear a wave sequence on that one. Really great. Halcyon and On used the Debussy on Wheels patch. Let me see if I can find that one real quick. I know it's towards the end. Here it is. So this is, I'm not going to be able to play the actual notes, but this is Debussy on Wheels that was used by Orbital. That's very true, Todd, for sure. And, to the point, Adapt, Manipulate, if you do want to hear this used much better than I can use it for industrial, check out Belgian EBM band Front 242's 05, 22, 09, 12 off album from 1993, because it is like all Wavestation and it sounds really great. And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk about my favorite Wavestation album of all time. Here it is, Beyond the Mind's Eye by Jan Hammer, who I am named after. My middle name is Jan, actually. And so I think my father he sort of knew where I was going in my life. So if you haven't checked this out, Beyond the Mind's Eye, it's for free on Jan Hammer's YouTube channel. It's a movie. It's basically a tech demo for what could be done with early 90s CGI. But the soundtrack is so dominated by the Wavestation. I mean, compared to anything else we could talk about, this soundtrack there's so much Wavestation in it. And I think that's why I have so much nostalgia too, because when I was growing up, 1995-ish, or whenever this came out, let's see if I can find it, usually there's a year on here somewhere. Whatever year this came out, I just remember watching this again and again and again on VHS. And I really synth albums. It's just pure synth. And of course he's got memory moogs and all of that stuff too, but you can hear the Wavestation and how much he was in love with the sound. So Jan Hammer was a huge fan of the Wavestation as well. So real quick, before we jump into the Legendary Synthesizer test, I just want to give my way of doing pros and cons, which is to talk about 3 people I think the synthesizer is for and 3 people I don't think the synth is for. So the positive, the people I think that should get the synth, is someone who's looking for the best sounding ultraviolet synth, period. I know I've said that the D50 is the best sounding ultraviolet synth, but for me personally, the presets on the Wavestation are the greatest presets of all time. It's the only time someone's been able to dethrone Eric Persing from being the greatest creator of presets, just because, I mean, when you listen to them, they really are just incredible. Here, the big pad, this is also sampled in the Legendary Synthesizer Sample Pack. That, Rick. I love that you have 3 of them. I will one day do a studio tour. Unfortunately it's not very high up on my list, just because I have so many other projects for this channel that I got to get done first. Yeah, I think they used to play it at like Radio Shack. That's awesome, Rick. Thank you for bringing me back. That brought me right back to my childhood. So some of these patches, like Peter Ski Schwartz, like creating a Ski Jam. Let me see if I can find that one. This is like the most overused patch from it. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Ski Jam. So this one. And you just hear how evolving that sound is. Just incredible, gritty character. So another person I think the synth is for is anybody who loves glassy ultraviolet pads with a lot of crunch. This is the best sounding Korg digital synth, in my opinion, period. I have another digital Korg that sounds this good. Of course, I love some of, Korg's analog stuff like the Poly 6 and the Monopoly. But for me, this is the highlight of their digital career for sure. And then third, I would say a really good user of a Wavestation would be a producer who's not into vintage synths at all, who wants to get something that has a really kind of fresh flavor, which I know is crazy to say for a synth that's 35 years old, but think about how retro music is. It's like Blinding Lights used a Juno 60, right, by The Weeknd, and became a sensational hit, played at the Super Bowl. And now we've had a little bit of time. And so what are people going to move on to retro-wise? And it's going to be this next era. So I think the Wavestation and these sorts of ultraviolet sounds are going to come back around again. And to get the rack mount version for $305 with shipping, like I'm almost going to buy it just to have one more Wavestation. I think it's worth it. So here's 3 examples of people I don't think the Wavestation is for. Someone who wants to program their own fucking sounds, because this is not what the synth is. I think of the synth a lot like a Rompler, like an Emu Proteus, or a Korg M1 for that matter, where you can technically program sounds, but 99.9% of people just played the presets. And when the presets are this good, why would you ever, do that? This patch, Entropy, is another one sampled in the sample pack. Just these gorgeous pads. And that's the thing, Travis. What I've found with writing this, oh, you're in the Caribbean. That's freaking awesome, Aquatic. Well, enjoy your time there, but thank you for stopping by. One of the best tricks with the Wavestation is to pick a sound and when you use it, like start your writing process with the sound, because if you don't do that, it's very easy to get lost, and it's harder to fit a Wavestation sound into a song later than it is to start with, because it's like a lot of the patches are hold down one key and print money. So here's another one. If you don't care about vintage, gritty, digital to analog converters and stuff like that, I think most people should get the Wavestation VST. I'm going to just say it. I know this channel's in large part about celebrating vintage synths, but the Korg Wavestation VST is the better way for most people to get these sounds and not have to spend an arm and a leg. Not that they're that expensive, but they're more expensive than not everybody has room for a big 61 key keyboard like this. And to me, I just think that it's probably the way to go. It's got more sounds, whatever, for someone who just doesn't care about that last little 10% of grittiness. Korg Trinity, that is fair adapt. That would probably be I would argue this sounds better, but that is a strong contender there. And then the third person I don't think the synth is for is someone who's looking for bread and butter sounds. That is just like bass lines, leads. You heard a couple of them in here, but it's not where this thing excels. Man, it's a great choir, but it's so like hyper realistic. So good. You know, it's not just a Rhodes, right? Because you do have that wave sequence in there. So it's just not ideal for someone who's trying to do that type of thing. So let me jump over to here and let's bring up some music here. It's time for the Legendary Synthesizer test. So the main event. This is a painstakingly devised series of 12 tests created by the help of you guys to see if a synth has what it takes to be called legendary. Here's how it works. For a synthesizer to earn the title of legendary, it needs to score 12 points or more. If it scores just 10 or 11, it's iconic. It's 8 or 9, it's classic. 6 or 7, it's respectable. 4 or 5, the synth is just aight, and anything less, we're diving into dubious or even impoverished territory where synthesizers gather dust in the back of the studio. So how do we score? I'll read each question aloud, and I'm going to post a poll in the chat. Yes means the Wavestation passes the test, and no means it doesn't. I'm going to pull up on my phone here, 1 minute. And it's always that way. So yes is always a pass, and no is always a fail. And you'll have 1 minute to vote on each question. You, the chat, get half a point for each question. I contribute the other half. So if you love or hate the Wavestation, let your voice be heard. The last question still counts for 2 points. Let's see if the Korg Wavestation can filter through the competition. Are you ready? Let's start the test. The first test is the John Hammond test. Did this synthesizer bring innovation to the industry and move synthesizer technology forward? So I'm going to start that in the chat right now. And so that poll should be there, and I'm starting a minute on the clock. So what do you guys think? Be very curious to see what people have to say about this. Balancing the layers is very easy just using the joystick over here. That's all it takes, which is great. While you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and open up, and so we can keep track of all the score over here. So what do we think? We're at 30 seconds left, so get your voices in, and we will see what you guys think. I'm quite excited to see what everybody thinks on this. This is, for me, the definition of a legendary synth, but I understand why it might fail some of these tests. So that's the great thing about the great thing about this is that it sort of forces you to be honest. Okay, so 91% of you guys say yes, it brought innovation. It's a clear pass, right? What Dave Smith and his team did was revolutionary, and although it's been attempted again with the Wavestate, it's still a revolutionary idea. There is not a hidden game in this. I believe that is the K2000, Carl. I could be wrong about that. So, moving on to the next question, which is the Daniel Day-Lewis test. I'm sorry, the Training Day test. Shout outs to 40 Thieves. Is this synth straightforward enough for a beginner to learn? 1 minute on the clock. Let's go. So the question is this a good synth for a beginner? And I'm not going to pretend that I think it is. It's not a synth for learning synthesis. In the way that, like, you just pull up sounds, I could see how someone could pass it, but I think it's not a beginner synth. It doesn't give you the flexibility to actually make your own sounds. I would say I'm an intermediate to advanced, at least in terms of time spent. Like, maybe not knowledge retained, but in terms of hours of my life sunk into a hobby, that would be an advanced amount of hours I've spent. And I would say that I can't program it, so therefore it's probably not for beginners. But I will understand some people voting yes, just because it's a simple synth. Something like an Emu Proteus, in a weird way, might pass this because there's no even attempt at programming it, right? So that's your minute. 72% of you guys said no, and I agree. I think it's easy to stop and say that does not count. So moving on to the next test, the Daniel Day-Lewis test. Can the synth deliver an expressive performance with features like velocity, aftertouch, arpeggiators, sequencers, and MPE? So this one's interesting because it famously eschewed an arpeggiator or a sequencer, but it can be kind of built in to the actual synth. So for me, I think it passes this, although kind of narrowly, and a big part of it's the joystick. So my thing is velocity, aftertouch, mod wheel, pitch wheel alone, I cannot pass a synth on that. But having the joystick here does add a lot of expressivity to some of the patches. You heard that some of the patches don't have it, but I do think enough of them do to make it worthwhile there. And it does have velocity and aftertouch. It's a decent enough key bed. It's not the greatest. But if I had to use it as a master controller for my studio, I would be happy. I've thought about if I ever went to sell it, take it off the rack behind me, I would probably just use it as my master MIDI controller so I wouldn't have to sell it. So that's a minute up. And 69, nice, percent of you guys agreed with me that yes, it should pass the Daniel Day-Lewis test. Although I would acknowledge it could be argued for sure. It could be argued for sure. I might be letting my bias get in there a bit, but luckily you guys seem to agree with me. The Roy Batty test. Was this synthesizer built to last with no major reliability issues or common problems? So what this test is sort of like the Juno 106 test in the sense of that synth famously has voice chips that fail because of, what is it? It's like a resin that they put on the chips that melts over time and you have to get it replaced. So this is a metal enclosure, since built like a tank. Nothing really that I've known that fails about it. I don't think there's any battery leak issues or anything. So for me, I think it probably passes this pretty easily. Korg synths from this era and Yamaha synths from this era were built like tanks. They were designed to be used on tour by bands. It's sort of the definition of a well-built synth. The Japanese, they were just kicking a whole lot of ass, and frankly, that's part of what put American companies out of business. Was Moog was putting out pretty unreliable stuff like the Memory Moog at a time when the DX7 existed, and people were like, yeah, fuck that. I'd rather have, the first time a Memory Moog or a Poly Moog goes out on you when you're live on stage and your DX7 never goes out, I could see why you would probably go for it. So we both agreed that it passes the Roy Batty test. So next up, we have the Aliens from Signs test, one of my favorite. Dubstation says, voted yes, but my Wavestation rack gets pretty hot. That's pretty cool. I didn't know that. So that's a good thing for me to know. And the Moog one. Signs test, if you've seen that movie, you probably know what this is about. Does the synthesizer avoid any major design flaws or missing key features? This one's really interesting because I got a Wavestation EX in front of me. The lack of drums, acoustic piano, and a resonant filter was considered a major feature missing from the synth at the time of release. Today, I personally don't think it's missing anything. I don't need a resonant filter on this. I guess the VST's got that. But I don't ever use the resonant filter in the VST because for me, the Wavestation is perfect as it is. The only thing I could say that I would add would, of course, be the knobs and faders from Wavestate so you could actually make your own sounds. But I don't think that's really fair. That's really a Nostromo test question. Dubstation, did you or do you have any other Wavestations or just the SR? I kind of think the SR is the way to go right now, to be honest, because it's got more sounds and it's just a single rack, so you could slip it in. It's not super huge. Sizes and everything. 65% of you agree with me. So we are going to pass it on the aliens from science test. But again, it's kind of arguable. I could see someone knocking me for that. So next up, we have the Elvira test. Does the synthesizer rank among the most beautiful or iconic in terms of aesthetics? Everyone knows the most important part of how a synthesizer sounds is how it looks. So I promised myself when I started the Legendary Synthesizer streams here that I would never pass a black metal box. And that's what this is. I love the way this synth looks. I think it's very professional and sleek looking. I think it looks better than the Korg M1, even though they're very similar enclosures. I think this one's a little bit more premium feeling. Lou DiCario, I agree. Flawless in the limitations of the synth. I agree with that. Wave Sequencer says memory architecture and resonant filter. Patch storage was a pain. Not enough voices either. I could see that. I count this as one of the most beautiful synths. I promised myself to really do just the rubric, protect it. And in this case, I just, yeah. I do. So adapt, manipulate. You and I are on the exact same page there. So 56% of you said yes, which I did upgrade the LED here to blue, and it's very nice looking. So this is the first time we're going to have a disagreement. So I refuse to pass this on principle, but with the acknowledgement that personally I do like the look, but I think that's my own bias about the synth. I have an SY99 that's I probably wouldn't pass either because it's a black box and because I'm not as, I think that's a great synth too, but I have a lot of nostalgic attachment. So, and that's correct, Spirit Groove. Wave Sequencer is the developer of Hyperion, a really incredible synthesizer that takes a lot of inspiration from the Wavestation as well as modular synthesis. It's really great. We've done a live stream on that synth on this channel before too. Worth going back and checking out. And your work with John Lemcool. That's amazing. Next up, we have the Starscream test. Does the synth transform into multiple roles, bass, lead, pads, and textures without losing focus? So this one's really tough for me. Up to this point, there's been a few on the line ones, but this one really stands out as, oof, this is tough. Because to be honest with you, it's not really my go-to for bass lines. You know, like I would not go to this synth for bass lines. It's probably okay. A lot of vintage EBM and industrial bands use digital synths like DX7s for bass lines, so I guess you could probably do something similar. I think this synth excels at pads and those wave sequency type sounds so well. I apologize for scratching my nose. The grass pollen is out of control here in sunny spring South Florida, and it is just wreaking havoc. The fact that I haven't been draining actively onto the synthesizer is a win as far as I'm concerned. I think I have to fail it because I just would never go to the synth for bass, unfortunately. But you guys, 65% said yes. So again, we have a split decision between the jury and myself. And I do think, yeah, I could do a drone bass. Could do a drone bass. I hear you, Jim. But it's definitely better for pads. I think it does really cool leads even. But it's just, I couldn't quite get there. But it's a soft fail because it's very close. It's very close. I could see someone doing it. I think if I did it, my thing is I like retro synths. I don't necessarily intend to make retro music. Said another way, if you use just the drums and bass and everything from this, it's going to sound like it's on the PlayStation 1 or the N64, and that's a really cool sound, but that's not always what I'm going for. I kind of like using the best of all of the vintage synths. So if a synth's really good at, you know, pads, vintage digital pads like this is, I'll probably use it for that. And then I'm probably going to use a badass analog synth like the Polyvox for bass, something like that. The Nostromo test. Can you program the synth easily without excessive menu diving or a programmer or editor? By the way, the wave state would fail this one because it is easier to program that synth with the editor than actually doing it with the hardware to an extent. The hardware is really good for performance, I think. So this is the definition of a synth that should fail the Nostromo test. It is just a labyrinthine mess, and there's just nothing in there. Yeah, the ZZ lead is awesome. This is just there's no way. I love that some percentage, 11% of you currently have voted 12% that yes, it's easily programmable, but this is the definition of a synth. You know, and even compared to the Korg M1, I found the M1 pretty easy to program, actually. It's not that bad, but if there was an editor for it, I would have used it. 90% of you agree with me that, yeah, it's a true synth nerd can really program this thing easily. So, yeah, it's not getting that fucking point from us. Not on my watch. The Deep Space Nine test. Does the synthesizer have deep modulation possibilities that keep sound designers excited? 1 minute on the clock. Yeah, of course it does, right? This thing's so deep. So deep. So it's the flip side of that coin where, no, it's not easy to program. Probably, you know, up there with the SY99 or the DX7 as one of the hardest synths to program. But I will give it that the screen's really great and laid out well. But as far as depth, there's probably no deeper. I mean, Ian Dixon was telling me that when he was recreating the Wavestation patches for Wavestate, he was like, but the truth is, the Wavestation is more powerful. So you had to take some shortcuts with Wavestate to get it to sound kind of like a Wavestation. And just when you think about that, it is the definition of a synth that should pass the Deep Space Nine test, in my opinion. But it's up to you guys, of course. That's the fun part about this, is we're deciding it together. 77% of you agree with me that, yeah, it absolutely should pass the Deep Space Nine test. So we're giving it a point. Yeah, K5000. Yep, that's right. I sold that synth because it was so hard to program. So that's probably even the better example, Rick. Let's see. Wave Sequencer says, it's easy peasy, just horrible patch storage. The Han Solo test. Has this synthesizer aged like a fine wine? I could see an argument on this one. I know what I'm going to vote. I think I know what most of y'all are going to vote. But I could see the argument. I could see it. Jim says there's many sounds on the Wavestate that the Wavestation can't touch. I agree with that too, by the way. I know I might sound a little negative on Wavestate. It's coming from a place of bitterness that Korg didn't put a vintage mode into it. I really would have loved a vintage button where you just kick it on and it has like a gritty vintage 90s sort of sheen over the top of it. Had they done that, I probably would have shut the fuck up. But you're right. There's all sorts of stuff you can do in Wavestate that you can't do in the Wavestation. And then technically there are things you can only do in the Wavestation that you can't do on the Wavestate. But I think most of the time that doesn't matter because the Wavestate basically gets you the way there. Analog Rick says, no, it's hideous. That's the Elvira test. 88% of you guys agree with me that it's aged like a fine wine, like Mr. Harrison Ford himself. Let's move on to the David Lynch test. The newest test added, does the synth have a distinct character that left a lasting mark on the world? I mean, come on. Yes, it did. Of course it did. How many other synths have left such a distinctive mark aside from something like a Mini Moog and a Prophet 5? This synthesizer does just define a certain era. And I think it's a very easy pass. For me, I could see someone maybe arguing that because it really wasn't replicated. You know, that maybe not. But right now, 100% of you guys are voted yes, which I appreciate the honesty there. I always wonder if there's going to be someone in the chat who just votes no to troll on a question like this. But yes, for me, it's the definition of something that should pass the David Lynch test. So I am happy to give it the point before the minute was all the way up. There was no way it was going to change. And now we are on to the final and most important question. So this is for 2 points. The Vangelis test. Do the raw oscillators and filter of the synthesizer have that magical quality? Does it need effects to sound good? Meaning, does it have to sound? And this is a tough one in a way. I'm voting yes, it does, because this is my one of, if not my favorite synthesizers. I know I've said on this channel before, this is my favorite synth. It's hard to say that when you have a Matrix 12 behind you. When I said that, I never thought in a million years I would have a CS70M and a Matrix 12 in the studio. So I may have to update that opinion, but I love the way the Wavestation sounds. I just think it's beautiful, and it's because of the character of the sound, and that's the Vangelis test, in my opinion. I could hear someone say, well, the resonant filter would be a fail because that doesn't have the filter doesn't sound great. And I think the thing is, with a synth like this, it's like the DX7 doesn't even have a filter, but that's not what the synth is about. And with wave sequencing, it's not what it's about. And 92% of you guys agree with me that it's not what it's about. So that gives it a total score of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10, let me go look real quick. What is a poor? Yes, finally we have an iconic synthesizer. So let's go over to the ranking here and let's enter that in. So we have our very first iconic synthesizer. So we've had some classic and respectable synths. And again, sorry for my nose being a motherfucker. But we've never had an iconic synth before, so I'm very excited about that. So we have our first iconic synthesizer, meaning we can move this up above everything, but just below the monopoly here. So it's iconic. And then we can do how many points it got. It got 10 points, right? So let me get that in there and pull that back right there. And then price per point. So what did we say the street price was? $6.50. $6.50 divided by 10 points is $65 a point. So there we go. There we are. So looking at this, you could see that it's actually one of the most affordable synths, because what do we have that's cheaper? The Mirage is cheaper trivially. The difference between $65 and $63 is the variance in the synth market from this stream to that stream, right? Yeah, I appreciate that Korg spam, everybody, because yeah, this is pretty crazy. Let's see. Mirage and the Poly 800 are cheaper. And the thing is the K1 and the Poly 800, I think deserve that respectable title of, like, they're not bad. They're actually better than you'd think for some people that really look down on those synths. But they're not classic, and they're not iconic, and they're certainly not legendary synths. I love them, but I do think the Wavestation is iconic, and I am so happy to see it up there. And at $65, for instance, if we were to combine the legendary, iconic, and classic synths and just rank them by price per point, it would be higher than most of the other synths, with the exception of the Mirage. Mode Man, have a great night, okay? Wave Sequencer, yeah, it's been something I've wanted to do for a long time. We actually started doing this. I started doing synthesizer stuff on Twitch in 2016 and stuff on this channel around then too, 2017, I want to say. for a bit, the live streams were just watching vintage movies, and I had a big vintage movie ranking. And it occurred to me we could do something like that with synthesizers, but get a little bit more technical with it. Todd says he might be biased, but his first synth was a Poly 6, but I've had a thing for Korg to this day. I think Korg is an incredible manufacturer. I've always loved the sound of Korg synths. I just think they sound good, and they always have had a philosophy of coming in just under the price point of everybody else. So they'll strip out a few features they don't think are critical. And I think with the Wavestation, though, it was really like they trusted Dave Smith and his team to make something incredible, and they did. So Wavestation SR is a great way to get the sounds of the hardware for a low price and low maintenance space. Yeah, so if you counted the Wavestation SR that I was talking about for $300, then it would be not 65 but like $33 price per point, which is just sweeping away the rest of the synths on this list. So it's got to be one of the most affordable synths as far as it goes. Rick May says, I don't understand my K1 too. It was free with an M-Audio Venom. I mean, that's awesome. I love the K1. The choir sounds are incredible. There's a lot of really great sounds on it. It's just that I have a K4, and most of the K1 sounds are in the K4, so I only did that. Portal Complex says, you should open phones. What does that mean? Fog Bongler, what a great stream. Thank you very much, Fog. You inspired me to fire up the Wavestation EX tonight. Thanks as always. I really appreciate it. That's the goal here. And, of course, I focus on vintage synths, but one of the things I really want to inspire people to do is take the gear you already have and make sounds that inspire you like you heard tonight in the stream. That's always what I would do, is I would hear a sound and I go, ooh, I want to try to capture that. And whether I was using a hardware synth or software, that's the best thing, is to use what you have. And, you know, it's amazing what you can do with some effects or whatever to get some of that vibe. And K1 is a total sleeper, I agree. Oh, and there is the Kawai K1 VST. At some point, I need to check it out. There isn't a K4 one. The ability to call in, right? Yeah, where people can call and offer their opinions, for sure. If you want that type of content, I would highly recommend subscribing to Angel Spit, the Art of Rock podcast. I listen to it every Saturday. It starts at noon my time, I think. 12 p.m. It's probably 9 a.m. California time. I might be wrong about that. Sorry, Carl, if I just butchered that. I'm always at work, so I can't ever participate. But I always listen to it afterwards. And if you like something that's like what I'm doing now, but with a bunch of industrial musicians and just really, or dark musicians, they're all really cool, interesting guys just sharing information. It's so valuable. So that's the Art of Rock podcast, Angel Spit. Right there in the chat. Just click and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. It's worth it. Definitely one of the best, content on YouTube right now. Don't get me wrong. I love listening to synth content like what I create from creators like Alex Ball and Starsky Carr and a million others, Synth Samurai. Sorry, I hesitate to even say anybody's name because I'm missing so many people. Yuki, Ian Dixon, so many. But what I love about Art of Rock is they really give you like practical stuff, like when it comes to how to do a live show or how to write a song or how to create a pad sound was a recent discussion. And it's like very useful, if maybe not quite as catnippy as, what's Arturia's new synth they're coming out with? I want to listen to how it sounds. I get sucked into that rabbit hole as well. I guess I kind of create that kind of content. But my goal is to inspire people to make music, to inspire beginners to get into making music, to celebrate vintage synths, but it's never to gatekeep or stop people or say vintage synths are better. I love the software. I've done a lot of videos on Disco DSP's OBXD, which is a free vintage sounding analog synth emulation that sounds a million times better than Behringer's bullshit vintage VST they put out. So I am not trying to gatekeep ever on this channel. I am fortunate enough to have such an incredible contact with these pieces of history. But the goal is to inspire, not to create gas or envy, because you really don't need these instruments. Even to get Wavestation sounds, that VST is great. I don't think there's a cheaper way than the $99 or $50 on sale Wavestation VST to get the sound. That's already very reasonable. So Vox Concrete's so good. ModWave is also very powerful county fare. 9 a.m. California time, 12 p.m. my time. So, Paul, I really appreciate it. There's a lot of great channels. Anyway, Lord Jar, it sounds better than the VST, because if it doesn't, why would you buy the hardware? I think it does. It's got a different internal sampling rate and, of course, vintage digital to analog converters. So it's going to have more grit, more character. I think it sounds more present. Like that gritty character pulls certain things to the front. It's kind of like a compression on those frequencies below aliasing or below the Nyquist frequency. But I do think the VST sounds great. And for most people, most of the time, the VST is probably the way to go. I really appreciate you, Todd. Unless you were talking about Angel Spit's channel, which that's also true. Lou Dicarius in all caps says, Vulture Culture's not gatekeeping. He just wants people to know that he has individuality on what people love to use. Yeah, I just love vintage synths because they're so unique and they all have their story and their bit of history, and that to me is captivating. And they do sound different. So I do want to document that. And I think something like the Legendary Synthesizer stream, it's actually about letting people have a guide to buying vintage synths. Like, what are really great synths to buy, I would say is respectable and up. And if you just look at that, price per point, K1, top of the list. Poly 800, top of the list. Mirage and Wavestation, those are your 4 best buys. You know, and what I love about that is you've got a Rompler, you've got an analog synth, you've got a sampler, and you've got a wave sequencing synth. So you've kind of got like your bases covered there as far as if you wanted to get into the game for not that much money. That's a way you could do it. Yeah. So I think that's a good place to call it for tonight. Usually the Legendary Synth streams are a little bit shorter, but this one ran a little long because I just had so much to say, because I wanted to talk about David Wise and his influence on me and the Wavestation's influence on him, which led to a whole new type of video game music and stuff like that. And so anyways, guys, I want to call it there for tonight, but thank you guys for being incredible. Continue to be excellent, and I will see you next week.